Hola amigos, Profe Winsor here. I have a question for you. Do you have any white water from cows? Pues amigos, have you figured out what today's video is about? Well, that's right. Circumlocution. Could I borrow a sharp tool for cutting paper? Can you please come help me make the house not dirty? We don't have dogs, but we do have two small house lions. Ah! Do you like cold sweet milk? I do. So let's talk a little bit more about el circunloquio, or circumlocution. So just running back through that list that I had at the front of the video, we're basically going around and describing or simplifying using some way the words that I have to get across the idea that I'm not really explicitly able to say, or I don't remember how to say, or something like that. So you tell me. White water from cows? La leche, milk, right? Sharp tool for cutting paper. Scissors, okay. Help the house not be dirty. We're talking about cleaning, right? Small house lion, el gato, right? And so basically there's a lot of little pieces or ways that circumlocution can happen, whether it's in in your classrooms or in conversation in real life, if you're traveling abroad, or even if you're a native speaker and you're speaking to someone in your native language, you're both in L1, you use circumlocution all the time. We just don't really think of it that way. So whenever you just don't have the explicit words to say something, maybe it's specialized vocabulary, like the plumber or the mechanic is working on something and you're trying to communicate something, but you don't know the names for those things. So it's a lot of, what's that thing for? Or can you make this go that way? Because you don't know the right terminology. Maybe you have some amount of vocab. You can express what you're trying to express, but in a limited way. Or sometimes just indirectly. Okay, so circumlocution, not bad. Circumlocution, very good, muy bueno, okay? And totally normal, totally natural. Some people, I kind of touched on this in the blog, there are some people that don't really like teaching explicitly any sort of communication strategy, because that's what circumlocution is, right? It's something to assist someone in their output of a language. So it's not an input strategy, it's an output strategy. But basically, it's kind of just freeing the student and empowering the student to be able to say what they can say. So I'm going to, let me define that just a little bit more. So when I learned about circumlocution in my master's program, the easiest word or the closest word that comes to mind is circumnavigation. So you've probably heard circumnavigation. What's happening with circumnavigation? Well, you're going around, or you're going in another direction, but you're still essentially trying to get to the same place. You're just taking a different route, okay? So otra ruta, to get where we need to go. And that could be an equal distance route. It could be a much longer, windy, curvy road. It could be some kind of backing up and not in a straight line and not super, not super direct or smooth maybe, but it's getting you there, right? So that's the point. So let's talk a little bit about circumlocution. And when I teach circumlocution, which I do teach it explicitly in my classes, I'm normally using target language because I have upper level students, so I'm speaking en español, but you can do this in English, en español, any language that you feel comfortable with for your students, through examples, through modeling. You're doing it explicitly and, just modeling and giving examples too. So, but it's so important because you're teaching the flexibility of language, and we don't want students to be translators, right? We want them to be communicators. And so that's a big thing in classes. We want them to be free and able to communicate, not perfect, because no one's perfect. So as I'm starting this idea, this concept of el circunloquio at the beginning of the year, I like to use visuals and kind of start from a place of defining fluency, because that's really one of the big stumbling blocks for a lot of students, and part of why they really need help with circumlocution, that it exists and that it's good. So with fluency, you hear so commonly, especially in English, are you fluent, right? Are you fluent? Is he fluent? Are they a fluent speaker, etc., etc.? So it's really a misconception. It's a bad place to start from, because when people say, are you fluent? Is this person fluent? They're really thinking in terms of black and white. They're really thinking done or not done. They're thinking, basically, without necessarily putting it in these terms, they're thinking more along the terms of this person knows all Spanish and this person knows nothing. You're either one or the other. And especially for those of us who have been in the language acquisition field for a long time, we know that everything is a spectrum. Proficiency is a spectrum. Even when you're speaking your native language, even if you've spoken it for 15, 20, 30, 40 years, that doesn't mean you know every word in that language, you know every expression, you know all this information and back history, and you could express every little detail and saying in the language. You can't, just like the example of the specialized vocabulary that I mentioned earlier. No one is a plumber, a mechanic, a lawyer, a police officer, everything in the world to know all of that specialized vocabulary in their first language. So we have to start from a place, we have to let students know, that fluency doesn't mean knowing everything in the language and about the language. Fluency, when you think about this term, fluency, someone is fluent, what comes to my mind and what I try to express to the students is fluid. I think of a river, right? Un río. So I'm thinking about a river passing through, and maybe it's making twists and turns, but what I really think of to visualize fluency and issues with someone's fluency, again, it's not a black and white. It's not an issue of perfect or not. It's an issue of being able to communicate. So when someone is fluent, they can communicate very easily. And that means both listening and reading, also speaking and writing. So when you think about a river, I'm thinking about the flow of water like the flow of conversation, or the flow of a dialogue of some kind, written or spoken. So what happens when there's kind of a little like rock or tronco, a little piece of wood or something like that in the water? Well, the water gets displaced, right? It kind of stops at first, but it goes around. It keeps going, right? So it doesn't just stop. It keeps going. And so that kind of image is the idea of fluency. Our communication has to be moving around, changing direction, doing whatever it can to keep going, because the goal is communication, right? The goal is to keep that flow going. So the goal isn't being perfect. The goal isn't knowing everything. No one is those things, right? But the goal is to keep the communication going. So if let's say that I have a very limited vocab, or I haven't acquired a lot of grammatical structures, things like that, that allow me to convey different thoughts, levels, complexities, tenses, all that kind of stuff. And again, not majoring on the grammar stuff, but as an element of communication. So if I have a lot of that stuff, then I'm not going to be impeded very much. I'm going to be able to get across what I want to get across, and I'm going to understand things with ease for the most part. When there's a big gap, let's say there's a big chunk of information that I've never been exposed to, I don't know terms about this certain area, then it's going to be hard for me to get across my ideas. Or if I've really only been learning my second language for a little while, and I've seen a little bit of some other tenses, past, future, but I haven't acquired enough of it to be able to spit it back out and tell you. So that's limiting to me. I can't quite express everything I want to express. It might cause some confusion for the other person, but there's still going to be ways that I can get some amount of information across at least. So when we're talking about circumlocution, we're not necessarily saying I've got some magic way to express every single detail in my second language that I'm thinking or wanting to express from my first language. It's about communication, not perfection, right? So that goes back to our first examples. Something like white water from cows. That's kind of like a poetic circumlocution, because it's not really a typical way that you would describe milk, but it definitely gives you some imagery and you can pretty much tell right away what that means. But I'm going to kind of go through literally what might be some different ways to circumlocute what you're trying to say. But that's the kind of basis, is to start from a place of what does fluency really mean? What does it not mean? And then where do I go from there now that communication is my emphasis? So for my students as well, part of that is reinforcing that idea that our ultimate audience is somebody that might not be bilingual. They might be only a Spanish speaker. So if I resort to English, or let's say I'm writing, this is something that teachers will see a lot of and scratch their eyes out when they're grading a writing sample or a test or something, and the student's doing well, they're saying what they want to say, and then they get kind of to this roadblock where they didn't know the word for something, but they didn't go around it, they didn't circumlocute in any way, they just wrote the English word and put it in quotations. So it's almost comical, but also a little bit drives teachers nuts, because you think about, my ultimate goal is not get something thrown out on a piece of paper or spit something out on a speaking exam. My ultimate goal is to really communicate and to be able to apply what I'm practicing to the world outside of this classroom, right? So I'm thinking about an actual person who really needs me to speak Spanish to communicate to them. And if I put a word in English in quotations, that's not helpful. There's no communication there. That's just putting another big rock in the river that's blocking the flow, right? So we don't want to add to blocking the flow. We want to work around. We want to circumlocute. Okay, so what ways can I circumlocute? What ways can I get around those rocks in the river, or those gaps in my vocabulary, or different structures that I haven't acquired to be able to express different things? So, obviously there's different, like we talked about earlier, you're going to circumlocute in very different ways. So there might be just kind of a slight adjustment. It's just a small rock. You're just to right around, and then you're back where you're needing to go. It might be something where you're, doing a lot of description. You're giving a good idea of what the word is, but you clearly don't know what the word is, and that person's going to still probably understand you pretty well. Or in some cases, you might not be able to give a pretty good description, and you might just simplify the idea, right? And then, and that could even look like not a beautiful full sentence, but you're giving out the ideas of, the words that you know. And kind of in line with that, like we had the example earlier of the white water with cows, or from cows, sometimes it's almost a poetic description as opposed to a really literal definition or description. And then sometimes, when you get really basic, especially if it's a conversation, which ultimately we're really thinking a lot about conversation, but it could be something written too. It's a two-way street when it's interpersonal. So it's not 100% on you to get the point across. You should do your best to get the point across, but it's a two-way street. So you are actively trying to communicate, and that listener is actively trying to listen to you and understand what you're saying and what you're trying to say, right? They're not just sitting there judging you, right? They're having a conversation. They want to know what you're trying to say. You want to say what you're trying to say, or express well what you're trying to say. So, sometimes when you're really, really limited, you can still cause that person to infer your meaning, and that's still communication, right? You're still trying to get your point across, that person's trying to understand you, and that works. A lot of times also, especially as you're learning a language, you might know or be able to recognize a lot of terms for things, but maybe you just can't throw them out there. They're not coming to your mind, or you haven't learned those specific terms. But as you're trying to get your point across, that person is also probably throwing things out like, oh, are you trying to say this? And you're like, yes, because you can recognize it a lot of times, even if you don't know it or can't remember it. So at the lowest level, maybe you're doing a little bit of getting the point across. Maybe there's gestures, maybe there's drawing, but there's some amount of words coming out of your mouth, and that person is going to be able to try to figure out what you're saying, and that two-way street is going to work out to be some amount of communication. So then thinking about what if it's kind of like a poetic description, something like the white water from cows. Just kind of recapping here. What if it is, maybe you can do a definition or a description of whatever it is. And that's something actually that in my Spanish classes I do a lot of. I have my students write out definitions in their own terms in Spanish of what the term is. And we refine that, we crystallize that as the year goes on. I do a lot of that in level 4, but I do some of it also in the lower levels, and a little bit in level 5 too. So when they're working on that, that's a skill that's not just mental or academic. Definition writing is in many ways practice for future circumlocution. And then when they're in their conversation time, I'm walking around listening to them, and I know that they're so locked into years of translation thinking, and so I know that they're going to hit those roadblocks. And so as I'm walking around, they might ask me, or I might just offer in a little bit of help. Well, you don't know the word for that, but you could say this, you could say that instead, and that way the communication is still happening. So the other thing is that circumlocution kind of ties in a sense with register or formality. So not only is it good to be able to try to create a workaround where you're expressing basically something on that same level that you would like to, which might be a little bit formal or very, very descriptive or very direct, but it might work its way down, be a little bit indirect, or be more simplified. But when you're thinking about sort of the classic example that always comes up of needing to go to the restroom, right? So maybe at the top of that formality or register rank, you might have someone that could say, excuse me, need some of my strong drink of the morning. Okay, then you might have somebody say, I drank a lot of water and I really need to use the facilities. Could you tell me where they are? Or maybe you have somebody that can't quite say that, but they could say, where is the restroom? Or you might have somebody that can do a little bit less, and they could say, I need to go to the bathroom. Or maybe a little bit less than that, and they can say, I gotta pee. Or maybe they can do a little bit less than that, and they can say, very simply, pee now. Where? Right? So at any level of that, communication is happening. Perfection, no nos importa, right? It's not even on the table. Communication. Now that doesn't mean, of course, that we want someone to stay down here in the simplest possible disjointed way of communicating something. We want them to grow, but we don't want them to be anxious about, quote unquote, the right way to say a thing. And we don't want someone to be limited and just hardly ever speak because they're waiting to absorb a whole lot more of the language. Now, it's natural to absorb a lot first. We do that in our first and other languages, but circumlocution is a way to help students not just sit there and wait and only absorb, and to really get them used to the idea that they can communicate. They can say a lot of things, actually, even in the first year or two. But they need to practice that. They need to be, educated to that point, have circumlocution modeled, and be given the freedom to do that instead of what's the word for, how do I say, all the time being drilled into my head. And that's something that also I work with a lot with my students who are native speakers or very high-level speakers. They have to learn how to modify down circumlocution-wise when they're speaking to someone who's a really low-level speaker, communicator. They not only in speed, but in terms of maybe the way that they express something. Are you using a whole lot of idiomatic expressions in what you're saying? Are you speaking in a way that's maybe too complicated for the person that you're speaking with? So one last example of what I was just talking about the simplification, was let's say you have a novice level student. They haven't had much experience with the past tense probably, and they need to communicate the idea, I lost my dog. Well, they don't really know how to say something in the past tense, and they may or may not have the word lost per se. So what could they say that still suggests or describes, or in a simple way or indirect way gets that idea across to someone who is also exerting effort to try to understand? Well, maybe a little bit lower than that, they could make a declaration like, no sé dónde está mi perro. I don't know where my dog is. ¿Puedes ayudarme? Can you help me? No sé dónde está mi perro. All that is still pretty simple and straightforward. Maybe even take a step down from that, and they could say just simply, ¿Dónde está mi perro? ¿Dónde está mi perro? Ayuda. ¿Dónde está mi perro? Okay? Or even a step down from that. Mi perro, ayuda. Mi perro. O mi perro no está. Mi perro no está. Ayuda. Ayúdame. See? So that could just step up, step down. That's circumlocution. So there's lots of other examples. Something that I do purposefully, actively, intentionally, and also naturally and without thinking all the time, en inglés, en español, etc. And it really helps students because it opens the doors for them. They're not thinking about what's the word for. They're thinking about how could I possibly get what I'm essentially trying to say across. And everybody's doing that. The amount of language output is going up in your classroom, so they're all feeding off of that, therefore getting more input too. So yeah, 3 cheers for el circunloquio. ¡Hurra! 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 Paz. Pues amigos, let me know in the comments any thoughts that you have, questions, concerns. What are some of your other experiences? Do you have a specific activity or game or method of something that you do in the class that ties in really well with el circunloquio? All right, people. Paz y amor.